Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history. A project so massive, it literally carved a new river through the heart of the desert. So before we get started, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy diving deep into ancient mysteries. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see our global community come together. Now settle in, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you think about ancient Egyptian engineering. Picture this. You're standing on the edge of the Sahara Desert 4,000 years ago. The sun beats down mercilessly. Sand stretches endlessly in every direction, yet somehow, impossibly, a mighty river cuts through this wasteland like a knife through butter. This isn't the Nile. This is something else entirely, something the ancient Egyptians built with their bare hands. The project I'm talking about makes the Panama Canal look like a backyard swimming pool. We're talking about the Bahr Yusuf, literally meaning Joseph's River in Arabic. But the Egyptians had a different name for it. They called it the gift of Ra, the sun god's blessing carved into the earth itself. And here's the thing that'll blow your mind. This wasn't just about moving water from point A to point B. This was about fundamentally altering the geography of an entire region. You see, most people think ancient Egyptians were just really good at building pyramids and mummifying pharaohs. But the truth is, they were master hydraulic engineers on a scale that puts modern projects to shame. They didn't just work with the land they had. They created the land they needed. And the Bahr Yusuf project was their masterpiece. But here's where it gets interesting. The aftermath of this engineering marvel wasn't what anyone expected. The consequences rippled through Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. Some were brilliant, others were catastrophic, and some effects are still being felt today right now as you're watching this video. Let me paint you a picture of what Egypt looked like before this project began. The Nile River was everything to these people. It was their highway, their calendar, their god, and their lifeline all rolled into one. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood during the summer months, depositing rich, fertile silt across the valley floor. This annual flood, called the inundation, was literally what kept Egyptian civilization alive. But there was a problem, a big problem. The fertile Nile Valley was narrow, sometimes just a few miles wide on each side of the river. Beyond that narrow strip lay the Red Land, the desert that stretched endlessly in all directions. And as Egypt's population grew and their civilization became more complex, that narrow strip of green wasn't enough anymore. The pharaohs needed more farmland. They needed more space for their growing cities. They needed more resources to fund their massive building projects and military campaigns. But most importantly, they needed a way to control the Nile's floods more effectively. Because while the annual inundation was a blessing, it was also unpredictable. Some years the flood was too small, leading to famine. Other years it was too large, washing away entire settlements. So around 2000 BCE, during the Middle Kingdom period, Egyptian engineers came up with an audacious plan. Instead of just accepting the Nile as it was, They would fundamentally reshape the river system itself. They would create an entirely new branch of the Nile that would flow westward into the Fayum Depression, a massive natural basin in the desert about 60 miles southwest of modern-day Cairo. Now, the Fayum Depression wasn't just any old hole in the ground. This thing was massive. We're talking about a natural basin roughly the size of Lebanon, sitting about 130 feet below sea level. It was like nature had carved out a perfect spot for a massive artificial lake, just waiting for someone clever enough to figure out how to fill it. But here's the kicker. The depression wasn't completely dry. There was already a small seasonal lake there called Lake Moeris by the Greeks, though the Egyptians called it something else entirely. During high flood years, some Nile water would naturally spill over into the depression. But it was unreliable, unpredictable, and nowhere near the scale the Egyptians envisioned. The engineering challenge was mind-boggling. They needed to dig a canal that would carry water from the main Nile, through miles of desert and rock, and into the Fayum Depression. But this wasn't just about digging a ditch. They needed to create a system of locks, dams, and regulators that would allow them to control exactly how much water flowed into the depression and when. Think about this for a second. We're talking about people who had never seen a steam shovel, never heard of dynamite, and certainly never had access to modern surveying equipment. Their most advanced tools were copper chisels, wooden levers, and rope. Yet they were planning to move millions of tons of earth and rock to create what would essentially become Egypt's second river system. The scale of the workforce required was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over 100,000 workers labored on this project for more than 2 decades. That's like having the entire population of a major modern city working full-time on a single construction project for 20 years. The logistics alone would have been a nightmare. Where do you house that many workers? How do you feed them? How do you organize their work? How do you transport materials across hundreds of miles of desert? But the Egyptians had something that racy and administrative system. They had an incredibly sophisticated bureaucracy most ancient civilizations lacked. Worker was cataloged. Every tool was accounted for. Every basket of earth moved was recorded by scribes who could read and write. The Egyptian state was basically one giant, well-oiled machine designed to organize massive projects exactly like this one. The actual construction began during the reign of Amenemhat III, a pharaoh who ruled during the 12th dynasty around 1860 to 1814 BCE. Amenemhat III wasn't just another pyramid-building pharaoh. He was an engineer at heart, someone who understood that Egypt's future lay not just in impressive monuments, but in practical infrastructure that would benefit the entire kingdom. The project started with surveying. Teams of engineers using nothing but rope, wooden stakes, and careful observation of water flow patterns mapped out the exact route the new canal would take. They had to calculate gradients to ensure water would flow properly. They had to identify the hardest rock formations and figure out how to cut through them. They had to locate the best spots for dams and regulators. Then came the digging. Imagine thousands upon thousands of workers organized into crews, attacking the desert with copper tools and bare hands. They worked in shifts around the clock. During the cooler months, they could work longer hours. During the blazing summer heat, they worked shorter shifts but never stopped completely. The earth they removed had to go somewhere. And here's where Egyptian engineering brilliance really shines through. They didn't just pile the excavated material randomly. Instead, they used it strategically to build up the sides of the canal, creating raised embankments that would help contain the water flow. They also used the excess earth to create artificial islands and peninsulas in the areas where the canal would eventually widen into lakes. But the real genius was in the water control systems they built. At key points along the canal, they constructed massive stone regulators, essentially ancient versions of modern dam gates. These regulators could be opened or closed to control water flow. During flood season, they could open them wide to allow maximum water into the Fayum. During dry periods, they could close them partially to conserve water in the main Nile. The stone blocks used in these regulators were enormous, some weighing several tons each. Moving them into position required sophisticated knowledge of levers, ramps, and pulleys. The joints between blocks were cut so precisely that even today, you can barely slip a knife blade between them. And remember, they achieved this precision using hand tools and techniques that would make modern engineers scratch their heads in amazement. As the project progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The Fayum Depression started to transform. What had once been mostly barren desert began to turn green. Water attracted birds and wildlife. Plants began to grow along the canal banks. Small settlements sprang up to house the workers and their families. But the Egyptians weren't just creating a canal. They were creating an entire ecosystem. They carefully planned which crops would grow best in the newly irrigated areas. They designed settlements that would be protected from flooding but still have easy access to water. They even planned recreational areas where the wealthy could come to hunt waterfowl and fish. The project took on a life of its own. What had started as a practical engineering solution became a symbol of Egyptian power and ingenuity. Foreign diplomats and traders would come from across the known world just to see this miracle of engineering. The pharaoh's reputation grew not just as a military leader or religious figure, but as someone who could literally reshape the natural world. By the time construction was complete, around 1800 BCE, the Bahr Yusuf had become Egypt's second great river. It carried roughly 15% of the Nile's total flow westward into the Fayum Depression, creating a massive artificial lake that the Greeks would later call Lake Moeris. This lake covered an area of roughly 700 square miles, making it larger than any natural lake in Egypt, except for the Great Salt Lakes far to the south. The immediate results were spectacular. The Fayum region, once mostly uninhabitable desert, became one of Egypt's most productive agricultural areas. New cities sprang up along the shores of the artificial lake. Trade routes developed to connect these new settlements with the rest of Egypt. The pharaoh's treasury swelled with taxes from the newly productive land. But here's where our story takes an interesting turn, because while the immediate effects of the Bahr Yusuf project were largely positive, the long-term consequences were far more complex and sometimes unexpected. The Egyptians had succeeded in their engineering goals, but they had also unleashed forces that would reshape their civilization in ways they never anticipated. The first major consequence hit within just a few generations of the project's completion. You see, the Egyptians had created something unprecedented in human history, a completely artificial river ecosystem. But ecosystems are delicate things. They're interconnected webs where changing one element affects everything else. The new lake in the Fayum Depression began to alter local weather patterns in ways the ancient engineers never predicted. The massive body of water created its own microclimate. Humidity levels rose dramatically in the surrounding areas. Cloud formation patterns shifted. Even rainfall, rare as it was in Egypt, began to fall in different places and at different times than it had for thousands of years. These climate changes had immediate effects on agriculture. Crops that had grown reliably in certain areas for generations suddenly began failing. Meanwhile, areas that had been too dry for farming became surprisingly fertile. Farmers who had inherited agricultural knowledge passed down through dozens of generations found themselves having to learn entirely new techniques. But the climate effects were just the beginning. The Bahr Yusuf had fundamentally altered the hydrology of the entire region. Underground water tables shifted. Springs that had flowed for millennia dried up, while new springs appeared in unexpected places. Wells that had served communities for generations went dry, forcing entire settlements to relocate. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous record keepers, and their papyrus documents tell us about the social upheaval this caused. Families that had farmed the same land for centuries suddenly found themselves forced to move. Property disputes erupted as traditional boundaries became meaningless when the land itself changed. The pharaoh's courts were flooded with legal cases about water rights and land ownership. More importantly, the project had created a new class of people, hydraulic engineers who understood how to manage complex water systems. These weren't traditional farmers or craftsmen. They were technical specialists who commanded high salaries and wielded significant political influence. For the first time in Egyptian history, technical knowledge became as important as noble birth or religious authority. This shift in power dynamics rippled through Egyptian society in unexpected ways. Traditional priests, who had long held authority over agricultural timing based on religious calendars, suddenly found their influence challenged by engineers who could predict water flows based on mathematical calculations. The old ways of doing things, passed down through religious tradition, began to compete with new methods based on empirical observation and technical expertise. The economic effects were equally dramatic. The Fayum region became incredibly productive, generating enormous wealth for the pharaoh's treasury. But this prosperity wasn't evenly distributed. The areas closest to the new water sources became extremely valuable, while regions that lost access to water saw their land values plummet. Economic inequality, which had always existed in Egypt, became more pronounced than ever before. The new wealth from the Fayum also changed Egypt's relationship with its neighbors. With increased agricultural productivity came population growth. With population growth came the need for more resources, more trade, and inevitably more military expansion. The Bahr Yusuf project indirectly funded Egypt's most ambitious military campaigns and most elaborate building projects. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence was how the project changed Egyptian thinking about nature itself. Before the Bahr Yusuf, Egyptians had seen themselves as working within natural systems. The Nile flooded according to the God's will, and humans adapted to that rhythm. But the success of the Bahr Yusuf project proved that humans could reshape nature on a massive scale. This philosophical shift had profound implications. If the gods had intended for the Fayum Depression to remain dry, yet humans had successfully filled it with water, what did that say about the relationship between divine will and human agency? Egyptian religious texts from the period after the project's completion show a subtle but important change in how they viewed the balance between human action and divine authority. The success also bred overconfidence. If Egyptian engineers could create an entirely new river system, what else might they accomplish? This confidence led to increasingly ambitious projects, some successful, others spectacular failures. The engineering mindset that had created the Bahr Yusuf began to influence everything from urban planning to military strategy. Archaeological evidence shows that within a century of the Bahr Yusuf's completion, Egyptian cities began to look different. Instead of simply building where natural features made construction easy, urban planners began reshaping the landscape to suit their architectural visions. Hills were leveled, valleys filled, and watercourses redirected to accommodate increasingly complex city designs. The agricultural consequences were particularly complex. The Fayum region became so productive that it began to specialize in crops that couldn't be grown elsewhere in Egypt. Certain types of grapes, olives, and luxury vegetables became associated specifically with the Fayum. This agricultural specialization created new trade networks and economic dependencies, but specialization also created vulnerability. When crop diseases or pest infestations hit the Fayum, they could devastate not just local food supplies, but Egypt's entire economy for certain products. The interconnectedness that made the system so productive also made it fragile in ways the original planners never anticipated. The success of the Bahr Yusuf also attracted attention from Egypt's enemies. Foreign rulers began to realize that Egypt's power wasn't just based on military might or natural resources, but on sophisticated engineering that could be disrupted. Military strategists from neighboring kingdoms began to study Egyptian hydraulic systems, looking for ways to attack Egypt's infrastructure rather than just its armies. This led to the development of entirely new forms of warfare. Instead of just besieging cities or fighting pitched battles, armies began targeting dams, canals, and water control systems. The very infrastructure that had made Egypt more powerful also created new vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The environmental consequences took longer to manifest, but were ultimately more significant than anyone realized. The massive artificial lake in the Fayum Depression began to affect wildlife populations across a much wider area. Bird migration patterns shifted, as the new water body became a major stopover point. Fish populations in the main Nile changed as some species migrated into the new waterways, while others found their traditional spawning grounds altered. These ecological changes had cascading effects throughout the food chain. Crocodile populations exploded in the Fayoum, creating new dangers for humans, but also new opportunities for those who made their living hunting the beasts for their valuable hides. Hippopotamus herds, which had traditionally been confined to certain stretches of the main Nile, began expanding their range into the new waterways. The ancient Egyptians documented these changes with their characteristic thoroughness, but they didn't always understand the long-term implications. What seemed like minor adjustments to local animal populations were actually signs of major ecosystem transformations that would continue evolving for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the Bahr Yusuf project established a precedent that would influence hydraulic engineering for thousands of years. The techniques developed for the project, the organizational methods used to manage such a massive workforce, and the administrative systems created to maintain the infrastructure became templates that were copied and adapted across the ancient world. Foreign engineers and administrators came to Egypt specifically to study the Bahr Yusuf system. They took this knowledge back to their own kingdoms, leading to similar projects across Mesopotamia, Persia, and eventually the Roman Empire. The engineering principles pioneered in the Egyptian desert would eventually influence the construction of Roman aqueducts, Chinese canal systems, and medieval European waterworks. But copying the technical aspects of the project was easier than replicating the social and administrative systems that made it possible. Many civilizations attempted similar massive hydraulic projects, but few had the bureaucratic sophistication and social organization necessary to complete them successfully. The Bahr Yusuf also changed how Egyptians thought about time and planning. The project had required thinking decades into the future, planning for problems that wouldn't emerge for generations. This long-term perspective began to influence other aspects of Egyptian society, from architectural projects to diplomatic relations. Religious practices began to evolve as well. New gods and goddesses associated with the artificial lake emerged in the Fayoum region. These deities weren't traditional Egyptian gods, but hybrid figures that combined aspects of water gods, earth gods, and human engineering. The success of the project seemed to demand new ways of understanding the relationship between human achievement and divine blessing. The administrative innovations required to manage the Bahr Yusuf also transformed Egyptian government. The project had required unprecedented coordination between different departments, regions, and social classes. The bureaucratic systems developed for the project became permanent features of Egyptian administration, influencing how the kingdom managed everything, from tax collection to military recruitment. Trade relationships shifted dramatically as the Fayoum region became a major economic center. Merchants who had previously focused on transporting goods along the main Nile suddenly found new opportunities in the artificial waterways. New cities and ports developed along the shores of Lake Morris, creating competition for established trading centers. The project also had unexpected effects on Egyptian art and culture. The dramatic landscapes created by the engineering work, with their artificial islands, controlled waterways, and planned settlements, began to appear in paintings, sculptures, and architectural decorations. Egyptian artists developed new techniques for depicting water and landscape that reflected the engineered nature of their environment. Music and literature were influenced as well. Songs and stories celebrating the triumph of human ingenuity over natural obstacles became popular. The heroic narrative of reshaping the desert captured the Egyptian imagination in ways that traditional religious or military stories couldn't match. But not everyone was pleased with these changes. Traditional priests and conservatives worried that the success of the Bar Yusuf project was encouraging dangerous hubris. They argued that humans were overstepping their proper relationship with the gods and the natural world. These concerns would prove prophetic in ways that wouldn't become clear for centuries. The tensions between traditionalists and engineers weren't just philosophical debates in temple courtyards. They had real political consequences that would reshape Egyptian society for generations. The pharaoh found himself caught between two increasingly powerful factions, each claiming to represent Egypt's true interests. The engineering class, flush with success and growing wealth from the Fayum project, began pushing for even more ambitious undertakings. They proposed extending the canal system further west, creating additional artificial lakes, and even attempting to connect the Bahar Yusuf to distant oases. Their confidence seemed limitless, and their technical achievements gave weight to their arguments. Meanwhile, the traditional priesthood watched nervously as their ancient authority eroded. For thousands of years, priests had been the ones who predicted floods, determined planting seasons, and interpreted the will of the gods regarding agricultural matters. Now, engineers with their measuring devices and mathematical calculations could predict water flows more accurately than religious divination ever could. This conflict came to a head during a series of unusually low flood years about 50 years after the Bahr Yusuf's completion. The main Nile barely rose above its banks, threatening famine throughout traditional farming areas. But the Fayum, with its massive artificial lake reserves, remained productive. For the first time in Egyptian history, the newer engineered region was feeding the older traditional heartland. The reversal of fortune was psychologically devastating for many Egyptians. The sacred Nile, giver of life, had failed them, but human engineering had prevailed. Traditional farmers who had mocked the artificial Fayum found themselves dependent nature of the on its produce for naturalness they survival. The very UN had criticized had become their salvation. This crisis accelerated changes that had been brewing. People began to fail since the project's completion. Young gawking to engineering schools that apprenticeships in farming and craft had emerged in the Fayum region. Traditionals became less attractive compared to the prestige and income of hydraulic engineering. Within a generation, Egypt had developed the world's first technical education system, but the human cost of this transformation was enormous. Rural communities that had existed for millennia found themselves abandoned as their young people migrated to the new engineering centers. Ancient traditions, passed down through countless generations, began to disappear as fewer people remained to maintain them. Languages, songs, crafts, and customs that had defined Egyptian regional culture started vanishing at an alarming rate. The Fayum itself was changing in ways nobody had anticipated. The massive artificial lake was slowly but steadily shrinking, not because of any engineering failure, but because of natural processes the ancient planners hadn't fully understood. Evaporation rates in the desert climate were higher than expected, while siltation from the Nile gradually filled in portions of the lake. This shrinkage created new problems. Settlements that had been built along the shoreline found themselves increasingly distant from water. Harbors became landlocked. Irrigation channels that had worked perfectly when the lake was full began to fail as water levels dropped. The very success of the project contained the seeds of its own transformation. Egyptian engineers found themselves in a constant battle against these natural forces. They developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for dredging silt, reducing evaporation, and maintaining water levels. But each solution created new challenges. Dredging operations, for example, required enormous labor forces and generated massive amounts of waste material that had to be disposed of somewhere. The environmental consequences continued to cascade through the ecosystem in unexpected ways. The artificial lake had attracted enormous flocks of migratory birds, which initially seemed like a wonderful bonus. The Fayum became famous throughout the ancient world for its spectacular bird life and lucrative hunting opportunities. But the bird populations brought their own problems. Massive flocks could devastate crop yields in a matter of hours. Certain species carried diseases that affected both humans and livestock. The nutrient load from bird droppings began altering the chemistry of the lake itself, promoting algae blooms that sometimes turned the water toxic. Managing these ecological challenges required expertise that went far beyond traditional Egyptian knowledge. The engineers found themselves becoming amateur biologists, studying animal behavior and plant growth patterns. They developed what were essentially the world's first environmental management techniques, though they wouldn't have recognized the terminology. The administrative burden of managing the Bar Yusuf system grew exponentially as its complexity increased. What had started as a single massive construction project had evolved into a permanent bureaucracy employing thousands of specialists, water level monitors, silt removal crews, wildlife managers, settlement planners, trade regulators, and countless scribes to document it all. This bureaucracy developed its own culture and interests that sometimes conflicted with the broader needs of Egyptian society. The Fayum administrators became a powerful political faction, lobbying for resources and defending their project against critics. They developed their own training schools, professional associations, and even religious practices centered around the technical aspects of water management. The economic effects of the project continued to ripple outward in ways that fundamentally altered Egyptian society. The wealth generated by the Fayum's productivity funded not just pharaonic building projects, but an entire class of merchants, administrators, and technical specialists who had never existed before in Egyptian history. This new middle class had different values and priorities than traditional Egyptian society. They were more interested in practical results than religious orthodoxy, more focused on innovation than tradition, more cosmopolitan in their outlook than the insular farming communities that had dominated Egypt for millennia. Their influence extended far beyond the Fayoum itself. They established trade networks that connected Egypt to distant lands in ways that had been impossible before. The reliable agricultural surplus from the engineered region allowed Egypt to import luxury goods, raw materials, and exotic products on an unprecedented scale. But this increased connectivity also made Egypt more vulnerable to external shocks. When trade routes were disrupted by wars or natural disasters in distant lands, the effects were felt immediately in the Fayoum. The region's prosperity, which had seemed so solid and permanent, proved to be dependent on factors far beyond Egyptian control. The military implications of the Bahar Yusuf project became apparent during Egypt's first major foreign war after its completion. Enemy forces, recognizing the strategic importance of the water control systems, specifically targeted the dams and regulators that controlled flow into the Fayoum. A small force of saboteurs could potentially devastate Egypt's second most productive region without ever engaging the main Egyptian army. This vulnerability forced Egyptian military planners to completely rethink their defensive strategies. They had to station permanent garrisons at critical infrastructure points, develop rapid response capabilities for engineering emergencies, and create backup systems that could maintain water flow even if primary controls were damaged. The psychological impact on Egyptian society was profound. The very engineering achievement that had made them feel invincible had also created new forms of vulnerability they had never imagined. The confidence that had driven them to reshape the desert began to mix with anxiety about protecting what they had built. These security concerns led to increasingly elaborate defensive measures around hydraulic infrastructure throughout Egypt. What had started as a single engineering project gradually militarized the entire Egyptian water management system. Engineers found themselves working alongside soldiers, and military considerations began influencing technical decisions. The cultural consequences were equally significant. Egyptian art and literature from this period shows a growing preoccupation with themes of human achievement versus natural forces, permanence versus change, and the price of progress. The heroic confidence of the early post-Bahar Yusuf period gave way to more complex and sometimes darker artistic expressions. Religious practices evolved to incorporate these new anxieties and complexities. Gods associated with water and engineering gained prominence, but they were often depicted as double-edged figures who could bring both blessing and destruction. The clear moral categories that had characterized earlier Egyptian religion became muddied by the ambiguous consequences of human achievement. The project's influence on Egyptian mathematics and science was revolutionary. Managing the complex hydraulic systems required increasingly sophisticated calculations, measurements, and record-keeping. Egyptian mathematicians developed new techniques for calculating volumes, flow rates, and structural loads that were far in advance of anything known elsewhere in the ancient world. These mathematical advances had applications far beyond water management. Egyptian architects began designing more complex buildings. Egyptian astronomers developed more accurate calendars, and Egyptian merchants created more sophisticated accounting systems. The technical demands of the Bahr Yusuf had inadvertently sparked a scientific revolution. But the most profound long-term consequence was how the project changed Egyptian attitudes toward the future itself. Before the Bahr Yusuf, Egyptians had generally assumed that the world was fundamentally unchanging. The Nile would always flood, the seasons would always cycle, and human life would continue following the same patterns it had for thousands of years. The success of the project shattered this assumption. If humans could create new rivers and reshape entire regions, then the future was not predetermined. It could be planned, engineered, and controlled. This shift in thinking would influence Egyptian civilization for the rest of its existence. Yet, with this new power came new responsibilities and new fears. If the future could be shaped by human action, then humans were responsible for the consequences of their choices. The weight of this responsibility began to press heavily on Egyptian society, creating psychological and spiritual burdens that their ancestors had never faced. The Bahr Yusuf had given the Egyptians godlike power over their environment. But as they were beginning to discover, wielding such power was far more complicated than acquiring it. The river they had carved through the desert had become a current that was carrying their entire civilization into uncharted waters, and the journey was far from over. The most dramatic consequences of their engineering triumph were still centuries in the future, waiting to transform not just Egypt, but the entire ancient world in ways that would echo through history to the present day. The ripple effects of Egypt's engineering triumph were about to collide with forces beyond their control. Because while the Egyptians had mastered the art of moving water through desert sands, they hadn't anticipated what would happen when the rest of the ancient world began to take notice. Word of the Bahr Yusuf had spread far beyond Egypt's borders. Merchants returning from trade missions carried tales of the impossible river that flowed backward into the desert. Diplomats described cities that floated like islands in an artificial sea. Mercenaries spoke of armies that could be fed from lands that had been barren wasteland just decades before. These stories reached the courts of Egypt's rivals. With the force of military intelligence, the Mesopotamian kingdoms, struggling with their own water management challenges along the Tigris and Euphrates, began sending delegations to study Egyptian techniques. The emerging powers of Anatolia dispatched their finest engineers to observe and learn. Even distant kingdoms heard whispers of Egypt's miracle and began planning expeditions to see it for themselves. But observation quickly turned to something more dangerous. If Egypt could create such abundance from nothing, what prevented other civilizations from doing the same? More importantly, what would happen to the ancient balance of power if Egypt's agricultural advantage became insurmountable? The first attempts at replication were clumsy and often disastrous. A Mesopotamian king tried to divert the Euphrates into a natural depression near his capital, only to flood his own palace when the water flow proved uncontrollable. Syrian engineers attempted to create their own artificial lake, but miscalculated the soil composition, resulting in massive landslides that buried entire villages. These failures only increased foreign fascination with Egyptian expertise. Suddenly, hydraulic engineers became the most sought-after specialists in the ancient world. Egyptian engineers found themselves receiving offers of enormous wealth to work for foreign rulers. Some accepted, taking their knowledge across borders and inadvertently spreading Egyptian technical secrets throughout the region. This brain drain began to concern Egyptian authorities. The pharaoh's advisors realized they were facing an entirely new type of strategic challenge. Their engineering superiority was their greatest advantage, but it was also their most vulnerable secret. Unlike military tactics or religious practices, hydraulic engineering could be learned, copied, and adapted by anyone with sufficient resources and determination. The response was swift and dramatic. Egypt began treating its hydraulic knowledge as a state secret equivalent to military intelligence. Engineers working on sensitive projects were required to take oaths of secrecy backed by severe penalties. Foreign visitors to the Fayoum were restricted to carefully controlled tours that revealed as little technical detail as possible. But secrets have a way of leaking, especially when they involve thousands of workers and decades of construction. Disgruntled engineers, ambitious foreign agents, and simple human curiosity combined to ensure that Egyptian techniques gradually spread throughout the ancient world. Within a century, modified versions of Bahar Yusuf technology were appearing in kingdoms from Nubia to Persia. The proliferation of hydraulic engineering knowledge had consequences nobody had foreseen. As other civilizations developed their own water management systems, they began to affect regional climate patterns on a scale that dwarfed even the Bahar Yusuf project. Multiple artificial lakes, canal systems, and irrigation networks began interacting with each other in complex ways. Desert regions that had been stable for millennia started experiencing unprecedented changes. Underground water tables shifted as massive engineering projects competed for the same finite resources. Ancient springs dried up in some areas while new ones appeared in others. Traditional nomadic routes became impassable as water sources vanished, forcing entire populations to relocate. These environmental changes triggered the first recorded instance of what we might now call an ecological refugee crisis. Tribes and communities displaced by shifting water patterns began moving in unprecedented numbers, creating pressure on established settlements and kingdoms. The very success of hydraulic engineering had destabilized the natural systems that countless generations had learned to navigate. Egypt found itself at the center of these upheavals, not as a cause, but as a destination. The reliability of the Bahar Yusuf system made the Fayoum region a magnet for displaced populations from across the region. Refugees, traders, craftsmen, and fortune seekers flocked to the artificial oasis, creating the ancient world's first truly cosmopolitan engineering center. This influx of foreign populations brought new ideas, techniques, and perspectives that accelerated innovation even further. Syrian metallurgists introduced new tools for canal construction. Mesopotamian mathematicians contributed advanced surveying techniques. Nubian specialists brought knowledge of working in extremely arid conditions. The cultural fusion that resulted was unlike anything seen before in Egyptian history. The Fayum developed its own distinct identity that blended Egyptian traditions with influences from across the known world. New architectural styles emerged that combined Egyptian monumentality with foreign practical innovations. Hybrid religious practices developed that honored both traditional Egyptian gods and the deities of immigrant communities. But this cultural flowering came at a cost. Traditional Egyptian society, already strained by the rapid changes following the Bar Yusuf's completion, began to fracture along new lines. Native Egyptians in the older regions felt increasingly marginalized as wealth, power, and innovation concentrated in the cosmopolitan Fayum. Regional tensions that had been manageable when Egypt was a more homogeneous society became serious political challenges as different areas developed distinct interests and identities. The pharaoh's court found itself mediating between increasingly divergent factions, each claiming to represent the true future of Egyptian civilization. These internal tensions were complicated by external pressures. As other kingdoms developed their own hydraulic capabilities, Egypt's monopoly on large-scale water management began to erode. Trade relationships that had been based on Egyptian agricultural surplus became more competitive as other regions achieved greater productivity. The Bar Yusuf stands as perhaps history's greatest lesson in the double-edged nature of human ambition. The Egyptians didn't just move water through the desert. They rewrote the rules of what civilization could accomplish, creating ripples that transformed the ancient world and continue shaping our relationship with nature today. Their triumph became their burden, their solution became their complication, and their river through the sand became the current that carried them into an uncertain future they're still navigating 4,000 years later.